Hello, welcome to Shut the Door, Steam Sterilization Principles You Need to Know. Tonight's program is sponsored by Crosstex, a Cantel medical company. My name is Leanne Kiefer, and I'm Director of Clinical Services and Education for Crosstex. Before we start tonight's program, I wanted to take the opportunity to thank those of you that have returned for the rescheduled webinar tonight after last night's internet technology issue and my little corner of Colorado at 7,800 feet. I have relocated for tonight's webinar to Denver, so I'm only a mile high, and we're hoping everything goes without an issue. So we're talking about successful steam sterilization, providing dental instruments safe for use with patient treatment. And so this program is going to discuss the basic principles of use, and we want to ensure that efficient and effective cycle. So basically, it's a simple thing. We place our appropriately carefully sealed instrument pouches or the wrapped cassettes into the sterilizer chamber, loading them appropriately, and then we close the door, we select the correct cycle, and we push the button. And within a reasonable number of minutes, the sterilization process is complete. But how much do we truly understand about the mechanics and the physics of what goes on behind that closed sterilizer door? Remember that steam is simply water in a vapor state. And today's sterilizers are very sophisticated and computerized devices, yet they still require that knowledgeable human being with critical thinking skills to determine the proper setting and to operate the sterilizer correctly for maximum efficiency. We also rely on performing instrument reprocessing based on the recommendation and practice documents from both CDC as well as AAMI Standard 79. And while the AAMI Standard 79 is not our primary go-to document in dentistry, for those of you that might be practicing in an ambulatory care facility or a community health center, some of these AAMI standards may be applicable in your facility. We also must follow the manufacturer IFUs, the instructions for use, for both the instruments as well as the equipment, the sterilizer units. We all know our instrument reprocessing 6 steps, or the ABCs. We're very familiar with that, and I'm not going to go into that tonight. But what I want to talk about is how effective steam sterilization requires things like proper preparation and packaging, correct selection of the cycle type, as well as the exposure and dry time. And dry time is important. We will have a couple slides on correct loading and unloading of the sterilizer because that can definitely impact the cycle, as well as an overview of the proper maintenance of the equipment. But let's look at these 6 items on the right-hand side. When we think about time, here's a way to sort of change it beyond just how long is the cycle. Different organisms don't die at the same rate. And so when we use our challenge organisms, or what we call spore tests, we use them because they are so resistant. They're so difficult to kill, more so than bacteria or viruses. And so essentially, steam sterilization, believe it or not, there's a 1 in 10,000 chance of a single spore surviving the steam sterilization cycle. And so with that, along with the bioburden difference, meaning on those tiny little spore strips that we use to test our sterilizers, there's about 100,000 spores on there, far higher number of a bioburden than we're going to find on the contaminated instruments that are going to be in our sterilizer. So essentially, we're working with an overkill situation when we're addressing our bacteria and viruses that may be on the contaminated instruments. Temperature is a big deal because it's the higher the temperature in the sterilizer chamber, the less time is needed to achieve sterilization. And this is particularly effective when we talk about steam sterilization, which is the #1 choice for dentistry overall. And we also know that pressure is involved with temperature, so the pressure helps to elevate and maintain the temperature during the cycle. A lot of people think that it's the steam, quote unquote, that kills during the sterilization cycle. It's the moist heat from the steam that's transferred to the instruments that actually causes the death of the microorganisms. Essentially, it cooks them, it coagulates them, and that's what causes the lethality. And that's why moist heat and having the appropriate moist heat, namely saturated steam, is so very important. And there's a number of things that we might do inadvertently if we don't think about, all the proper protocols that could in fact impact that moist heat, that saturated steam. We also need to have direct steam contact. That steam has to be able to touch each and every millimeter of that instrument in order to be able to transmit that heat energy to kill the organisms on the instruments. So that's why things like not overloading or misloading your pouch, not overloading or misloading the sterilizer is going to be very important for the efficacy of steam sterilization. Air removal. Easiest thing to say is air is the biggest enemy of steam, because what's going to happen when air comes in contact with steam, essentially the molecules move further apart and you're going to end up with more moisture and you don't have the saturated steam. So we have to make sure that we get all of the air out of the sterilization chamber. And that also can be impacted if we are not following appropriate loading, as well as the mass, the weight of the instrument that we're putting into each sterilizer. And last but not least, dry, dry, dry. Instrument packs, as well as the internal surfaces and the instruments, must be dry before they're removed from the sterilizer. And we'll talk about that in a little bit more detail in a moment. Just a quick definition: sterilization, the goal is to eliminate or destroy all forms of microbial life to render the instruments safe for use with patients. There are a number of factors that affect the sterilization process, and we've all heard the stories from Oklahoma, most recently Florida, where inadequate sterilization has led to the possibility or the risk of transmission. And we know that the case in Oklahoma was the first documented case of direct transmission of Hep C from one patient to another. And so these are just some of the factors that might affect. Before we get into the actual sterilization process, we need to make sure that we're doing the appropriate cleaning, because you cannot sterilize a dirty instrument. Any type of debris or organic bioburden left behind on the instrument could prohibit the sterilant from reaching the instrument itself. Properly preparing and packaging the instruments for sterilization. We also have to make sure that we're selecting the appropriate cycle, the sterilization parameters. If you have pouched or wrapped cassettes, you want to make sure that you are selecting the wrapped cycle. Yes, the unwrapped cycle is shorter, but it's not going to be able to transmit the heat as efficiently because it's not set to handle the packaging that's involved. So we have to make sure that we're choosing the right cycle. And last but not least, when we do storage of our instruments, we have to make sure that we're implementing the appropriate controls to maintain the integrity, and otherwise not to compromise the integrity of the packaging that's going to help to maintain the sterility. Ideal sterilization method. This isn't any new information. We said steam sterilization is the most efficient method that we have, and it hits each one of these criteria. It is highly efficacious against all types of organisms. Obviously, it's very rapidly active because with the right time, temperature, and pressure, you can achieve sterilization within a very short period of time. It's able to penetrate into openings or lumens, nooks and crannies of instruments. And because we're working with water, basically steam comes from water, as long as you have a heat tolerant instrument, it's going to be compatible, it's non-toxic, obviously it adapts well, and it can be monitored by both chemical as well as physical and biological means. We want to make sure that we have a working knowledge, that our thought process knows what we need to avoid. And so we want to make sure that we're not making any mistakes, any human error mistakes that could potentially result in a non-sterile load. And I will tell you, after working in biological monitoring for over 8 years now, the number one reason for biological monitoring or spore test failure is human related, and it's from overloading the sterilizer. We also want to make sure that what we're doing is not going to influence negatively the performance of the equipment, that we're following the manufacturer's IFUs. Also, obviously, to avoid any personnel injury of the clinician using the sterilizers. When we have sterilizer issues, it can impact our productivity, so we want to make sure that we're following best practices rather than common practices. We also know that if we don't follow the appropriate maintenance schedule as outlined by the sterilizer manufacturers, that can in fact result in higher operation and maintenance cost. Quick little note on PPE. When we're doing sterilization or preparation, we have to make sure that we're wearing the basic eye protection, face mask, fluid resistant gown or jacket, and using heavy duty puncture resistant, chemical resistant utility gloves. Some facilities may require hair and or shoe covers based on their individual protocol. It has been stated very clearly in the AAMI Standard 79, and it's been referenced in many dental research pieces, that we should have a dedicated hand washing station that's not going to be used for instrument rinsing or washing. When we are using the same sink to clean dirty instruments that we're going to wash our hands with, we can actually contaminate the faucet, the sides, the bottom of the sink, and that can contribute to cross-contamination. A most recent recommendation by AAMI is mentioning that we should have an alcohol-based hand rub dispenser near our instrument storage area, so that when we are selecting the instrument pouch or package for use, we should be using alcohol-based hand rub before we touch the sterilized instrument pouches or packs. Workflow, you know, it needs to go in one direction, whether that's clockwise, counterclockwise, whatever works in your facility. You want to make sure that you have those 3 different areas well marked, whether it's by a sign, whether it's by colored lighting that may be in some of your sterility centers. You may have red lighting at one end and blue lighting at the other that indicates contaminated on the red end and sterile on the blue end. You also need to have a clearly demarcated packaging area, whether it's having some sort of a partition that's placed between the contaminated and the packaging area, or if that's not a possibility, at least putting a piece of tape that runs down on the countertop that says this is contaminated, this is clean. We need those visual identifications. And here's just a point that I read this past week. It's recommended that the minimum width, the walkway space in your sterilization area, should be 4 feet wide. And this allows for passerby going in 2 different directions. This is my PSA announcement. There is recommendation that when you are taking your instruments after you have put them through the ultrasonic and you've rinsed them, and now they have to be dried before you package them, and you would be placing them on a non-linting or lint-free cotton. That means paper towels are not allowed. You can end up getting lint on the material, on the instruments, and then when you put it into the sterilizer, believe it or not, that lint can actually get out of the packaging into the steam, and it can cause clogging of the filters. So using absorbable cotton, 100% cotton lint-free towels is what is recommended. We said air and steam don't mix. Air inhibits the ability of the steam to be in contact with the instruments. And we also know that air is heavier than steam. So when the steam comes in, it's going to put the air toward the bottom. And this is why we always say the area of most challenge is going to be the bottom tray of your sterilizer, because that's where the air, if an air is going to get stuck, it's going to get stuck in the bottom part of the sterilizer. And so you want to make sure that we get all the air out of the sterilizer, and we're going to talk about the options for the different sterilization methods to do that. There are two different methods of steam sterilization, or types. Let's call these types. It would be passive versus dynamic air removal. The passive type is going to be with what's called a gravity displacement sterilizer. And these have been around for years and years. And essentially it's the one that has the boilerplate in the bottom, that the water comes in, water begins to boil, steam goes up the side of the chamber, and as the steam fills from the top, the heavier air is pushed down, i.e. gravity displacement, until it's pushed out the valve at the bottom of the unit. And there's actually a heat regulated valve that then closes to allow the pressure to build up. So this is a passive system. You're relying on the air filling, the steam filling the chamber to push the air out. The next thought is we have dynamic air removal. And with dynamic air removal, there's two different methods. So the dynamic is the type. The methods, one of them is called a pre-vac. In Europe or Canada, they might be called a Class B sterilizer. What happens with these is they work by displacing the air with, they work by using a vacuum pump or an ejector that ensures the air removal from the sterilizing chamber before the steam is admitted into the chamber. And so this type of process is dynamic because there's a pump or an ejector, and it's also going to be much more efficient. It's going to be faster because you don't have to wait for the steam buildup. It is recommended with a pre-vac steam sterilizer that a Bowie-Dick test is used once a day, and this is a test that all it's verifying is air removal. It's not talking about the lethality like your BI test because it's only a shortened cycle. It doesn't even go through the dry cycle. It just says that yes, all the air has been removed. And it's a chemical indicator. It's a stack of cards in a box. The box is placed on the lower shelf of an empty sterilizer. The shortened cycle is run, and then the center card is pulled out to look for the color change from beginning to end. There are some new sterilizer models that have built-in air test, which would eliminate the need for the Bowie-Dick. We also have, in the dynamic air removal type, a steam flush pressure pulse, and it's often abbreviated SFPP. And again, this is another type of active process where there's an alternating steam flush and a pressure pulse that are both above atmospheric pressure. And this keeps alternating until the chamber is filled with the saturated steam. Air leaks are not an issue in this particular method of steam sterilization, so the Bowie-Dick test in a steam flush pressure pulse unit is not required. I'm such a visual person, and I work in analogies because then I can remember how something happens. And when we talk about steam sterilization, I use the term it coagulates the proteins. And essentially what happens when the saturated steam condenses on the instruments, which are of a lower temperature, that transfer of heat causes the protein material inside the microorganisms to coagulate just like the white of an egg would when heat was applied. And it's important to understand the difference of what saturated steam is. If you think about this teapot and you see that there is the end of the spout of the tea kettle, and then there looks to be an empty space, and then you begin to see the billowy, steamy cloud after that. The saturated steam is not the billowy, steamy cloud. That's where the air has hit it, and it's allowed the molecules to move further apart, and so they're going back into their water state. What we want is that evaporated steam, or the vapor, and that's where that empty space is between the opening of the spout and the very beginning of the billowy cloud. That blank spot isn't blank. That's where the saturated steam, where the most efficient vapor that's going to transmit heat is. That's the moist heat that we want to work with. I'm just going to do a quick mention of qualification testing. And qualification testing is to be performed whenever we put a new sterilizer into our practice, or if a sterilizer has been relocated from, one area to another, one building to another, or if there's been major malfunctions or major repairs. Right now in the CDC guidelines, qualification testing is not defined. However, the AAMI Standard 79 does explain how qualification testing should be done. I will also mention to you tonight that each one of our sterilizer manufacturers, our mainstream sterilizer manufacturers, in their IFUs for their unit, qualification testing is an included process. So it may be something that you want to look into as doing for best practice. And essentially what you're doing is putting a PCD, or a process challenge device. Essentially, it's going to be a box, again, just like the Bowie Dick is in a box. And that box is going to contain a stack of cardstock. And the middle cardstock, instead of having a chemical indicator, may have a type 5 or an integrating indicator, and or it may have a self-contained BI vial like you see in the picture. So what they want to do is use this before you use a new sterilizer. So obviously perform before it's put into service, and each type, if you use both a wrapped and an unwrapped cycle in your practice, each one of those cycles needs to have a qualification testing. And again, I said the PCD pack could include both a biological indicator, a self-contained spore test, and a type 5, or it may just have a type 5 by itself. With a tabletop sterilizer, which is any sterilizer that's less than 2 cubic feet, you run it with a full load of instruments, and it's not just one test, it's 3 consecutive of these tests. So if you're running only one cycle, a wrapped cycle, you would need 3 PCDs. If you're running both a unwrapped and a wrapped cycle, you would need 6 PCDs. And the recommendation is to wait to use the process items until the BI tests are available. So again, right now our CDC dental guidelines are not mentioning qualification testing, but it would be something to look into and be ready for. I also want to talk a little bit about IUSS. We're full of acronyms tonight. Immediate use steam sterilization. It used to be called flash sterilization, and it is the shortest time possible between a sterilized item's removal from the sterilizer chamber with an aseptic transfer to be immediately used in the field, the dental field, the treatment area. AAMI is very clear that sterilization of unwrapped items is not recommended as a standard practice. So the guidelines are obviously terminal or full sterilization is the preferred or best practice method. If you have a true emergency, if you only have one instrument that does a certain procedure and it inadvertently gets dropped, you have that unanticipated event, that's when IUSS would come into play. You must read the instrument's manufacturer IFU to know what the IUSS protocol is. It actually has to have an IUSS protocol listed on that instrument IFU in order to be able to process it that way. The dynamic air removal unit is preferred over a passive or the gravity displacement for obvious reasons. It is recommended to use a cassette when the instrument is processed and to include a type 5 integrating indicator in that cassette. Now, obviously, you're not wrapping the cassette because you're doing it as an unwrapped cycle. The cassette allows you to do an aseptic transfer from the chamber to the point of use, and it is important to remember these items must be used immediately. They cannot be stored for later use. And the documentation is very detailed when you do IUSS, and so that's something that you can look into with the AAMI Standard 79. So, steam quality. Is it just water or is it? And when we talk about water, we know that we don't use tap water in our sterilization, in our sterilizer, because there can be totally dissolved solids, which would be things like some of the minerals like calcium, sodium, iron, or chlorine. We don't want that to be in there. That's why we tend to use distilled, deionized, or reverse osmosis water. We also want to make sure that we understand the difference between steam quality and steam purity. When we talk about steam quality, that's what we're talking about with the saturated steam, the less than 3% moisture level. That's steam quality. While steam purity has to do with the chemical contaminants, like the minerals, that might be in there. When we want to remove those totally dissolved solids for use of the water in the Steri Center, we're often using, like I said, distilled, deionized, but hyperfiltered water can be a little bit more user-friendly. Hyperfiltered water can go through a reverse osmosis process, then following other filtrations to remove any additional solids. Because what we know is water is the universal solvent. And water that is totally void of any of the totally dissolved solids, it makes it hungry, and it's going to be looking to find that where it's passing through, meaning that it can leach it from the equipment that it's being exposed to. And so we don't want to use water that has zero totally dissolved solids. And some distilled water can be a zero totally dissolved solid. We really don't want to go any lower than about 5 parts per million. And this is going to allow our sterilizer to operate much more efficiently. So even city water isn't pure enough for sterilizing instruments. We know that. The problem is those totally dissolved solids. And an easy way to think about this is this isn't like the sand and the soil that's in the water. Those are the suspended solids. These are the dissolved solids. So imagine you had 2 buckets of pure water, and you put a handful of sand in one of the buckets, and you put a handful of sugar in the other bucket. If you stirred up that bucket with the sand and then you poured it through a coffee filter, those totally suspended solids would in fact be removed. But on the other hand, the sugar, which is the totally dissolved solids, if you would pour it through a filter, would not be removed. So just a little bit of a way to think about the difference between suspended and dissolved solids. And we talked about the 3 main methods for creating best water for our sterilizer. When we work with reverse osmosis, essentially it's a form of physical filtration. And there's actually a semi-permeable layer or a semi-permeable filter that when the water is coming in, dependent upon the pressure that's on the water, it's going to pass through this semi-permeable filter, and that water is going to be processed to remove the totally dissolved solids, so that when it's going to be released into our sterilizer, we're going to have good purity water for safe use with our equipment. And I forgot to flip those, so we'll just go through that part again. All right. Now, when we talk about distillation, distillation works, and some of you may have distillers in your practice, or you may be doing where you have to go out and purchase jugs of distilled water and bring them back to your practice, which is obviously a challenge sometimes. But what distillation does is it heats the water to its boiling point, that 212 degrees, and it turns the water, the liquid, into a vapor, and that vapor is then collected within the distiller. And then when it goes back to its liquid state, the totally dissolved solids are left behind, and you're looking for water that is essentially also a neutral pH. And when we talk about neutral pH, we're somewhere between 6.8 to 8.0. The issue with the distillation process, besides either having to go to the store, if you have one of these in your office, it can often require several hours to process and produce just 1 gallon of distilled water. And the filters for this need to be changed quite frequently, and it also can consume a lot of energy. So it may not be the best option that you have to get the best water for your sterilizer. So when we do deionization, deionization allows us to do this hyper-filtered water. It basically, it connects directly to the city water, and then it can send the water through a series of different deionizing and filter processes that it's going to produce water that can be either used in your bottled water system for your dental unit water that you're using with patients, or it can also have a different type of water, the low TDS water, that would be used in your sterilizer. So again, we talked about the water for steam sterilizers. We want it to be of very high purity water. With this, it can be a 0 TDS. And we also know that there are some sterilizers that will use fresh water with each cycle. So it's actually plumbed in, and with fresh water cycles, they either need to be filled more frequently and or have an automatic feed that will provide fresh water. And realize each time you boil water, it's going to leave behind, or it's going to become quote unquote more hungry. So those units that will actually recirculate water in the sterilizer, one of the trade-off is they're going to require more frequent maintenance because of potential clogging and clogging of the filters. We also know that there is wastewater from steam sterilizers that needs to be collected, and there's a condensation bottle that many of you are working with in your offices. And that can be somewhat inconvenient to have to empty very steaming hot water bottles manually. We also know that sometimes humidity can cause damage, or leaks can cause damage within cabinetry. And so there are methods that you can actually collect the discharge water after each cycle, and it's going to be processed directly after a cooling system that's built in, so that water can be sent directly to the drains as opposed to needing to empty the collection bottles. Quickly, what I want to say about water for instrument washers, as well as water that we use to rinse instruments after they come out of the ultrasonic. The water in instrument washers, and these are phenomenal pieces of equipment that can really help to be very efficient in the cleaning cycle. But the water becomes very aggressive because it can become somewhat oxidized due to the heat, the air, the chlorine levels, and that can cause spotting of instruments. And so it's recommended by instrument manufacturers, it's recommended by AAMI, it's recommended by the instrument washer manufacturers that the final cycle would be using a low TDS water for the final rinse cycles so that it helps to wash away any of the mineral content that could otherwise result in spotting or corrosion of our dental instruments. So using a high purity water, you wouldn't necessarily want to use it for the whole cycle because you're going to be going through a bit bigger volume of water. So using it at the end of the cycle allows you to get the least problematic and best results after the instruments have had their final rinse. And this is the statement from AAMI saying that tap water can be used for the initial rinsing to ensure that all, the debris, the detergent has been removed. However, the final rinse should be used with treated water, i.e. low TDS, whether it's using an automated washer disinfector or during manual or ultrasonic cleaning. We're going to switch now to a little bit of the packaging part of sterilization, and this is the age-old question, paper or plastic? And which side goes up? And the answer is neither. Best practice as recommended by sterilizer manufacturers, instrument manufacturers, packaging manufacturers is that the pouches or packs should be positioned vertically on a rack, almost like books on a shelf. And there should be space in between each pouch or pack to allow for 360-degree circulation of the sterilant. Now, that's best practice. And some of you may say, well, we do horizontal loading in our office. Look at your sterilizer manufacturer's manual, instructions for use, because they will specify that if you are choosing to do common practice, meaning horizontal placement, many of them are saying it is plastic side up, and you have to make sure that it's in a single layer. They cannot be overlapped. They should not be touching the side of the chamber. Obviously, this is my statement that I always say, Houston, we have a problem because this is a misloaded sterilizer that I guarantee you the contents are not going to be rendered sterile as a result at the end of this cycle. Just because you can fit them in like this does not mean that it's best practice. And I'd like to thank the Midmark Corporation for these pictures because I think this illustrates beautifully some of the options that we have for placement of both pouches as well as packages inside of a sterilizer. And you'll see that using the racks allow for the spacing of the pouches so that in fact both the steam and the drying cycle can adequately access all the instruments. When you see the common practice of horizontal loading, you're seeing only one layer on each shelf and they're not overlapped. When you see that if it's an all cassette load, you do see bits of space in between each. They're not tightly packed together. And if they are going to be placed horizontally, they have to be placed on a rack that suspends each one of them, that they're not resting on top of one another. And you cannot put pouches on top of a cassette that's lying horizontally. All right, wet packs. When we said we were going to talk about dry in a little bit, wet packs are a major concern that I think sometimes we tend to just accept it that it sometimes happens. Wet packs must not be touched. Wet packs have to be fully packs have to be fully dried before we can remove them from the sterilizer. We can't take them out of the sterilizer and put them on the countertop to dry. One of the reasons is the countertop could be a cooler temperature than the instruments inside the pack. And when you put those metal instruments down on a cooler surface, you're just going to get more moisture than you had to begin with. You also can't do things like put them under a fan or under an air conditioning vent because you are having a risk of cross-contamination due to wicking, W-I-C-K-I-N-G. Until that paper is dry, that means the pores of the paper can still be open, and whatever types of organisms or fomites may be on a surface could in fact be transferred into that package that is still wet. And so what causes wet packs? Basically, one of the first things is poor steam quality. If you have air, if you've not loaded your chamber correctly and there's air that's trapped in there, if you didn't use the correct cycle time and drying times, if you didn't place the configuration, how you put the pouches and packs into the sterilizer, or you weren't mindful of the mass, the weight load that's set by each instrument or sterilizer manufacturer. So in most cases, a single wet pack, if you take out 7 packs and only one of them is wet, usually that's due to some type of user error. And again, overloading is the number one thing that we look at. If you do have wet packs, you need to find out, is this it's an incidental occurrence. It's not common. If it's become common, you need to look into and figure out what's causing this. And the instrument packs wet instrument packs cannot be released. If it's always in one particular area of the sterilizer, it could actually be that something is wrong with the sterilizer itself. So you have to do a little bit of work when you are dealing with wet packs. Okay, when we're measuring performance, we want to make sure that the sterilizer is in fact doing what we're counting on it to do. And so we use different types of monitoring devices. That includes the physical, the chemical, and the biological. The physical is basically looking at your gauges, your LED readouts to make sure that the sterilizer has reached its appropriate time, temperature, and pressure for the given cycle that has been selected. Those physical monitoring values do not guarantee sterilization, nor does the turning of the chemical indicator, because remember, chemical indicators are evaluating specific parameters of the sterilization cycle. Some of them are going to be monitoring like sterilization tape. The only thing that evaluates is heat. It doesn't say anything about the pressure or the time. Now, if you're moving into something that's a multi-parameter indicator, then that one would have to measure at least 2 out of the 3 variables of steam sterilization. But the gold standard, what we count on to prove lethality, is biological monitoring. And that's when we're doing our weekly spore tests. So what happens if you get a failed result on your spore test? In other words, the spore strip or vial that you put in, when it was incubated, the spores still grew. According to the CDC, we need to stop use of that sterilizer. And it's not just pop another BI in. You actually have to go back and do a decision tree and review and try and figure out what happened that might have caused that failure. Again, because we know that steam sterilizers only truly fail about 1 to 3% of the time. That leaves 97% of the time are things that we may have done wrong. So you have to review the procedures that you had gone through. Then the sterilizer does need to be re-challenged with a full load of instruments for a tabletop sterilizer. That strip has to be placed in the area of most challenge where air is likely to get stuck. You're likely to have an air pocket. So on the bottom tray of the sterilizer, either over the drain or by the door, and then you run another BI along with your chemical and physical monitoring. If that second BI comes back and it has passed, it's negative for spore growth, you may then put the sterilizer back into practice. Now realize that that repeat BI test, if you get the failed BI test on August the 30th, there should be an immediate retest listed on August the 30th. It shouldn't be September the 6th that the next test is done. The rechallenge has to happen immediately while that sterilizer has been taken out of service. Now, we talked about human error. Some of those things may be, you've got heavily wrapped items are packed too tightly together in the chamber because it won't allow for the flow, the circulation of the steam. Heavier items placed on the top shelves, the load is too dense, meaning you have too much weight beyond what that sterilizer can compensate for in that cycle, or they're positioned incorrectly. Or if there are pouches, they are placed and stacked on top of one another. These are just some of the possibilities. If there's a true sterilizer failure, meaning it's an equipment failure, the things that may need to be evaluated are, did the gasket fail that you have a leak? Or did one of the valves or filters fail and you had an air leak? And a utility failure is just a fancy way to say you had a power outage during the cycle. There also can be process failures related to the sterilizer itself, relating to the cycle temperature, the time, again, incomplete air removal, or if you have wet steam rather than the saturated steam, can result in a sterilizer failure. Finally, inadequate maintenance or use of inappropriate equipment. An Instapot that's a steam cooker is not a sterilizer. Remember, sterilizers are considered by the FDA to be a type 2 medical device, and they have been tested to perform as such. So a Black & Decker toaster oven does not constitute a dry heat sterilizer. So what happens if that retest on that biological indicator, that second test that you did, if that comes back as a consecutive failure? The game changes at this point according to the CDC. It still remains that you cannot use that sterilizer, but now you can't use it until it has been inspected and or repaired, or the exact reason for that second failed test has been determined. And if you think you found the exact reason, I would encourage you to document this in your sterilization log in case that ever comes up in question. Now, with this one, if you're on the consecutive failure, all items from suspect loads dating back to the last passed or negative BI should be recalled to the extent possible. And we realize in dentistry that we tend to go through instruments at a pretty rapid rate, so you may not be able to recall all of the instruments. Fortunately, because remember we talked about that overkill situation in the very beginning, and the fact that a true sterilizer failure is 1 to 3%. We're not in a total panic situation. However, what you can recall should be recalled. They should be repackaged and reprocessed. And obviously, you're going to recall them based on the date that's written on each of your pouches or packages. At this point, what you must do is the sterilizer does need to be rechallenged, but it's not just with a single BI test. You need to put 3 consecutive BIs in 3 consecutive loads and run it with a full load of instruments. All 3 of those BI tests must pass in order to put the sterilizer back into service. If one of those doesn't pass, you need to start over at the very beginning with inspection, repaired, or exact reason. And so in your logbook, if we had a failure on August the 30th, and then we had another failure that came back, say we sent it in on August the 31st, and we got it back on September the 3rd, and it showed another failure. On September the 3rd, I should see 3 log entries of testing that's done and being submitted. So that kind of date tracking is very important. I am going to mention what the CDC refers to as a conservative approach related to failures. A conservative approach might be a protocol that you establish in your office with steam sterilizers that says anytime you have a positive BI, meaning anytime you've had a failure, that constitutes an immediate recall and reprocessing of instruments. You know why this is considered a more conservative approach, because we talked about the overkill situation, true failure at 1 to 3% of the time. CDC does not say it has to be done. The conservative approach must be done on a steam sterilizer. However, for those of you that are using methods other than steam sterilization, so I'm talking about things like dry heat primarily, if some of you may have chem vapor sterilizers, those type of sterilizers are required to follow the conservative approach on the first failure. On the first failure. So when you do recall and reprocess, again, it's since the last passed BI test. We want to make sure that when you are writing on your pouches and packages that you're dating them, that you're identifying the specific sterilizer that item was processed through. You need to remove the items, repackage them, and obviously sterilize them in another unit or wait until that unit has passed its biological testing. If you didn't write it down, it didn't happen. And, so if you're using a mail-in service, obviously part of a mail-in service does the documentation for you. If you're using in-office, that's totally acceptable by the CDC as well, but you need to make sure that you're writing everything down. Make sure that you're writing it down in pen, not in pencil. If there's an error, just make a single strike through. Date it and initial that strike through so there's no confusion as to what was being written. Also, in that logbook, when you do any type of sterilizer repair, maintenance, or calibration, it's a great idea to include that in your BI log, because then you have a complete history of that particular sterilizer's health, so to speak. And the question that I often get asked is, how long do we need to retain these records? Basically, it's determined by your State Practice Act. A safe number is a minimum of 3 years, and I will guarantee that if an office is going to be audited, one of the first sets of documents that's going to be requested is going to be your biological monitoring records. And so keeping a minimum of 3 years is just sort of a safe zone. I know that there are states that have 5, 7, 10, and indefinitely listed. So you need to find out what your particular state requirement is. When we finish up, when we talk about sterilizer maintenance, what does this mean? And it's not one of those things that just because it's running, we're going to let it keep going. Yes, I know that sterilizers are the workhorse of our practices, but there are very specific instructions in the manual for each sterilizer as to what has to be done routinely on a preventive schedule, as well as a calibration. So things like, what would you do for inspection and routine? Some examples, cleaning the external surface with a soft, dry cloth. You may need to use a soap and mild detergent sometimes. Don't use chemicals on the outside of your sterilizers. You don't want to use a surface disinfectant, because remember, the outside of that housing is going to get hot, and if you have any residual chemicals, it can cause color discoloration and or pitting. Checking the door gasket, making sure that you sort of wipe that surface with a damp cloth meaning water, because that gasket, that orange gasket, is what helps to seal that sterilizer to allow for the steam. So if you've got any type of fiber or dirt or dust, it can impact and you can get an air pocket. You also would want to pay attention to error codes that some of the newer sterilizers, don't just shut it off and try and get it to run again. Figure out why you're getting that error code and respond appropriately. Some of your sterilizers can actually be connected to the cloud, and your sterilizer manufacturer would be able to call and advise you as to what needs to be done. Preventive types of things would be when you would actually do a chamber cleaning or to clean the trays. This is usually done on a weekly basis. Scheduled would be things that would be monthly and quarterly. So monthly things might be something like flushing the system, and that may protect some of the filters and valves in the unit. There is recommended by at least 2 of the major manufacturers that you perform a pressure relief valve check on a monthly basis. Obviously, a pressure relief valve is a safety issue. And then also cleaning the chamber drain filter. Remember when we talked about those fibers? If, as the water drains, if those fibers get stuck in the drain filter, it's not going to be able to allow the air and the water to escape, and you can have, that's where you get the wet steam issues. On a quarterly basis, you want to remove and clean the door gasket. Sometimes you need to replace it. Helps to have an extra one in your practice already. So if you begin to see it turning the brown color and the craze lines, it's time to replace that door gasket. There are certain parts that need to be lubricated periodically. And there's a list of what they would call expendable parts. And if you can have some of those selectively in your practice that are easy to replace, it can sometimes save a more expensive service call. So again, write these things down when you do them. And as far as calibration, each manufacturer is going to have a recommendation for a formal service calibration, which obviously has to be done by a technician. An example of calibration may be every 3 years or every 3,000 cycles. I'm not making that as a general recommendation. I'm just giving that to you as an example. Okay. So we've gone through a lot of different parts of sterilization that we need to be aware of. And they're just like the pieces of a jigsaw puzzle, that they're cut to fit together perfectly and precisely in one way and only one way. And if you start being creative and jamming pieces together that don't actually fit, or skipping a piece here and there, it's going to ruin and confuse the puzzle. And you're going to have a problem that even if a single piece is missing, you're never going to get the whole picture. You're not going to have the desired result of sterilization of the instruments. And so your outcome is going to be flawed. So you want to really avoid the imaginative or the tribal learning way of doing things, and follow the best guidelines, follow the IFUs, follow the CDC guidelines, follow the AAMI standards. And that way you're going to get your best basic principles of sterilization. And with that, there is an 800 infection control helpline available to you that's listed here, that you can call Monday through Friday, 8 to 5 a.m. Mountain Time, and that will be answered by clinicians, and it is an anonymous helpline. And so with that, I'm going to open up to questions and answers. And I'm going to flip on. The question came in from Ashley: how often should you replace a filter? And there's a number, Ashley, there's a number of different filters in each type of sterilizer. And so in your manual, there will be a guideline in the back that sort of gives you those recommendations on how to evaluate it, how often to replace it. I can't give you a definitive because it's dependent on each sterilizer manufacturer. And if you can't find the original book that came with the box when you opened the sterilizer, I've been able to go online to each one of the main sterilizer manufacturers, and I've been able to download the manual directly from the internet. So it makes it easier to get it. Can you use drinking bottled water as distilled water? If you're talking about the recommendation from your sterilizer manufacturer is going to say either to use distilled water, deionized water, reverse osmosis filter, or hyperfiltered water. Drinking bottled water is not going to necessarily have the totally dissolved solids removed, and that is not within the protocol, so that would be considered off-label use. The next question is, if you have pouches in your office, you're supposed to have, the plastic side up, I think we've already answered that best practice, whether it's pouches or packs, would be to load them vertically like books on a shelf using a rack If you do use horizontal loading, follow your sterilizer manufacturer recommendation as far as plastic or paper side up. The vast majority are now saying plastic side up, and they should not be overlapped. I think we talked about inspection already. I'm going to slide down just a minute, see if there's other ones. Okay. Could I show the anonymous helpline number again, please? We'll see if my technical colleague is able to back up the screen. Otherwise, it's 8558 sterile. There you go. It's back up. Thank you, Trung. How do you keep your packs standing? There are what they call original manufacturer racks, original equipment racks that come with the sterilizers, or you can buy from your dental dealers racks that will sit on top of the trays in your sterilizer to keep them positioned appropriately. Something I forgot to mention, when you use those racks, the plastic or paper, like it all has to be plastic facing one way or paper facing one way. They can't be alternating because you don't want paper to paper to be able to touch. So all plastic forward or all paper forward. The question about the lint-free cotton towels, there's a question on microfiber towels, and I understand that microfiber towels have been effectively used because, again, they don't lint. However, it's found that they're not necessarily as absorbent as a 100% cotton towel would be. There tends to be a little bit more runoff. With a multi-provider office, I really feel like we need a sterilization tech. I can understand this is a very difficult, it's a very complex process, and we need to make sure that the people that are in fact responsible for this have been appropriately trained when they started with the practice, and there should be at minimum annual training. And I will share with you, Christy, the CDC has a phenomenal checklist. If you go to the new summary document that was published by the CDC in 2016, there's a great section on instrument sterilization, and in the back there is an observational checklist that you can use to make sure that you're crossing all the T's and dotting all the I's. So the CDC 2016 summary document. Question about water for the filter for the water distiller. Yes, that does need to be replaced frequently, or when it's scheduled to be replaced, or it needs to be replaced because of the buildup in the filter. Can you run instruments and handpieces on the handpiece cycle? You need to follow. Okay, that was a great instrument, or a great question, Lisa. You need to follow the instrument manufacturer's reprocessing recommendations. You should have copies from each one of your instruments and equipment that you have in your practice, because you have to run that instrument based on the validation that's been provided by that instrument manufacturer. And remember, instruments and handpieces are two different types of things, because the handpieces are hollow, there are lumens, and so it's much more difficult to get the steam to be able to penetrate all the way through the lumen in a handpiece as opposed to a solid instrument. So you need to follow both the instrument and the handpiece manufacturer's IFUs. And let's see, how are we doing on time? I think I'm going to take one more question. What's the best way, and I'm going to rephrase this question a little bit, Kaylee. What's the best way to get an office to be compliant with sterility assurance? And I think the first thing is to make sure that everybody's on the same page. So, going through a training, whether it's a webinar or maybe it's an on-demand webinar. For example, this webinar is going to be available on demand in about 2 weeks. That if any of your colleagues miss this, you can go through that. We also, on our crosstextlearning.com site, have a 6-core course, which means there are 6 different sections, and it's called Because You Can't See Sterile, and it takes you through each of the 6 steps of instrument reprocessing. You can take these sections individually in any order that you want to. And then when you finish, you end up earning 3 CEUs. So that would be a great way. The other thing is to get the CDC summary document and review the section on sterility assurance and look at both of the checklists in the back. The first checklist is an administrative checklist that makes sure that you have all the written protocols done correctly. The second is an observational checklist. And with that, I am going to thank each and every one of you that have been here tonight. I appreciate your time. And you'll have the instructions as to how to get your CEUs at the end. On behalf of Crosstex, thank you very much.